agenda item 7C next, which is the motion on the tendering of the housing plan maintenance contract. Cllr Councillor Newbold to move motion C.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think before I begin, actually, I'll just touch on the things I just heard, because both the leader and the executive councillor, in responding to Mr Woodcock on this point, have said that they have no ideological preference one way or the other about the delivery of services from this local authority. Well, I'm afraid I'll put my hand up now and I say I do. And I do believe that public services are better delivered by council employees for the public for many of the reasons that we've heard just before. And I think it's also interesting that many of the meetings that I've been to over the years here, there's been Mr Taylor here and there's been one or two smatters of people, but we haven't really seen many people in the audience, and today the place is full. And that suggests perhaps that you've got this one wrong. And maybe you actually have, we'll see, that you've got the legality of the thing right, but morally I suggest there's a big question mark as to whether or not you've got this one right. But to my motion, Madam Mayor, I appreciate we're in the middle of a tendering process, and I suppose we shouldn't forget that it won't be awarded until confirmation of admitted body status, or indeed, as we've just heard, the legal issues are, in terms of compliance legislation, are actually ascertained. But we are where we are. However, it doesn't mean that improvements can't be made into the process in terms of how we get contracts in the future, or that we shouldn't make an effort to measure performance of this particular contract or others going forward, perhaps by regular 6-monthly or whatever appraisals. The motion seeks not just to establish how we got here and that we're getting value for money on cost and quality, but I'm trying to broaden the whole debate to actually remind us that when we do let contracts and services go out the door, that we do more than look for efficiencies. We do worry that you see control, sometimes excessively. There's risk to capacity. You could actually say that with contracts like this, there's a danger of internal asset stripping if you're not careful. There's definitely a risk to reputation. And as the GMB pointed out, there are risks not just to the workers, the tenants and leaseholders in terms of health and safety. Goodness, I myself have had lots of emails, calls over the last few weeks, not just from tenants but also from members of the public, etc., worried about the performance of certain contractors. And I shall leave Councillor Herbert to make a specific point on that report. Now, why is it important to review this whole process, not just in terms of quality, cost, health and safety, etc., but the whole framework for letting contracts? I'll give you an example to illustrate what I'm talking about. And I'll use another contract that went out the door from Cambridge City Council, that of our leisure services, which went to SLM, Sports and Leisure Management, a few years ago. Now they do things like Chopin's and Liberty Centre in my ward. What happened when that contract was let? Yes, of course, because of legislation, City Council staff were cheated across and their terms were let. But not all City Council staff transferred are still there. As SLM took on new staff over the months to replace those that went, the new staff were employed with no sick pay and no pension. And as for those City Council staff that are still there, well, they've had no pay rises for the last 4 to 5 years. I'd be very interested to hear, perhaps from Simon or from Deborah, whether or not this is actually a legal thing that is happening. Now, I asked some questions this morning on this particular contract. Did it show that the costs of transferring staff by cheaply were catered for, so that we can have some sort of assurance, we could be reassured that it will be absorbed and managed, those costs? No. All tenders were made aware that they had to allow for any costs, but they didn't have to give us any details as to how they were going to be accounted for. Was any long-term impact on transfer staff from other successful bids explicitly shown? Should they reassure staff that over the 5-year term of this contract that they weren't going to see difficulties arising? No. Nothing explicitly shown. They just have to confirm that they do not intend to alter terms and conditions of transferring staff. Now, I use the SLN example because it's a good illustration of how companies can put in bids for work which are lower than those than the internal bidder. It's in the expectation that they'll be able to make a significant chunk of costs, take a significant chunk of costs out of the business. It's a win-win for the contractor. The more staff who feel undermined, demotivated, demoralised by changes to work practices and pay, and then decide to leave, the more costs that are then stripped out and the more profit for the contractor. Similarly, the more former council staff who leave, the more new staff with no sick pay or pension can then be replaced. So I wonder over the terms of the 5-year contract whether or not there's an expectation that there should be a healthier return as it moves forward. And this isn't an isolated example, SLM. The GMA have just told me of a similar maintenance contract let in Peterborough recently, in months, only a matter of months. They'd managed to tube across everybody, but only 40% of those who went across the original workforce retained. That's a big change. I won't talk about Connaught, somebody else might mention that. These sort of things have an impact. Make no mistake, there will be a change, including the loss of direct control over the works. There are risks, especially if it goes wrong, health and safety again. Our tenants will see changes. We've heard about this. Non-familiar vans, non-familiar accents and faces, no more liveried people. I mean, one other example. A few months ago, we had some vandalism to the bus shelter in Cherry Hinton. It's an Agshell bus shelter. How many of my colleagues, council colleagues, have had to try and deal with an external service provider to get things done and make a comparison with an internal one in terms of how quickly you can get results? 2 months it took, with 8 or 9 phone calls, loads and loads of emails and protestations. It's a bus shelter where people want to sit down, the elderly, so they can get the bus to Edinburgh for their appointments. When you outsource things, you outsource control. It makes it more difficult to exercise response. I'm sure we can have other examples that we can use. It's unfortunate, but perhaps it shouldn't be expected, to find us here this evening on a 1980s debate about contracting out. But then again, didn't Nick, Dave, Danny and George look so happy together yesterday afternoon? I was reminded of the newspaper headlines from just a few weeks ago. Suffolk to contract all services and become a virtual authority. Well, as yesterday's cuts start to bite over the next few years, is Cambridge City Council about to become more of a commissioner of services? Or do we have other alternatives in 2010 that perhaps we didn't think of in 1982, etc.? There are other alternatives, and I'll touch on that on a positive note. Myself, Councillor Todd Jones in front of me, Councillor Hurd, etc. We're not just Labour councillors, we're Labour and Cooperative councillors, and we on this group signed recently up to the Property Council's mission statement. We heard again from behind me, Mr. Doug, about tenant management organisations giving people control, mutual solutions. These offer a way to protect and improve frontline services, and it will do if people are involved, rather than by contracting out, and it will do so increasingly as the public service does bite. Mutually owned organisations have an important part to play.
Well, you've had 10 minutes. Could you drop it?
I will do, yes. For instance, here at Mill Road, there are ways that we can make this work. One big point about Councillor Smart's point that we would have made sure we would have liked Mill Road to have won this contract. And she says, sorry to Mill Speed, we would have liked City Services to have had it. But why didn't the City Council assist its own team to submit a quality tender? Particular as one of the key individuals' jobs was also abolished at the time, the head of building services, I recall, and he's currently on sick leave. It's shameful that this assistance wasn't given. And now, one last paragraph. Hiding behind an audit commission's suggestion is shameful. It's in the gift of you, the ruling group, to decide where this contract goes, where it's based in-house. It's a shame more creative solutions weren't explored, and it's even more shameful that this might not end up being another route that the City Council, as a commissioner, not provider of services, ends up with a different template for running the authority. We all know there's lots of interrelated parts of this business. If in 3 or 4 years' time there's no depot down at Mill Road, but instead another housing and retail development site, and there's no depot elsewhere, then we'll know exactly why we write this let contract